I'm probably going to cause quite a bit of controversy with this, but the Zoe diet, the anti-inflammatory diet, all of this yap about ultra-processed food being terrible and we should remove it, is making losing weight and eating well with ADHD worse rather than better. Because here is the controversial take. Processed food can be very, 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 very helpful and should be something that most ADHDers include in their diet. Now, before you panic, I'm not saying that nutrition quality doesn't matter. I'm not saying that processed foods are great. I'm saying the way that we talk about them and the way that we are demonizing them is really not helpful for a neurodivergent brain. Now, over the last year, when diets like Zoe and all this talk about anti-inflammatory and processed foods started to blow up, I thought it was quite interesting. I started to do research because I am always here as a fitness coach and professional to try and better my health in any way I can. So if I think there is a food source that I should eat more or less of that's going to make me healthier, perform better mentally, physically, I'm going to do it. And all of this microbiome and blood sugar data, I thought it was quite interesting as a bit of a geek. But when I really sort of thought about it through an ADHD lens, I just kept thinking that is so much. Like, there are so many things to do, like from a cognitive perspective, like, all of these different things, like it's executive function overload, right? So when these systems, increase a lot of cognitive load around food, it creates avoidance rather than consistency. When there are so many things to consider and track and be aware of, it can create shutdown. Now, when ADHD brain starts something, no matter how challenging a diet is in terms of the rules and what you can and can't do and how fancy the meals have to be and the things you have to track, we usually can do really well at it because it's novel and exciting. So we've got so much energy and that kind of overrides the executive dysfunction. So if you've ever done a diet before where there are loads of rules to consider, meals have taken you ages to prep and plan, maybe you do have to track loads of things, you've been fine, right? But then that starts to fade. And this is one of the biggest problems I see with things like the Zoe diet for ADHD brains, because there are just so many things to consider. When that executive dysfunction starts to kick in because the dopamine novelty is worn off, that's when you fall off track. But then you blame yourself. You don't think it's the diet's fault, you blame you. But it was just that this diet was never going to work with how your ADHD brain functions. And consistency is key, right? Consistency is what's always going to drive the best fat loss results. And if something is creating avoidance rather than consistency, it's never going to work. We know from research around adherence, so being able to stick to a diet, that simpler rules, simpler food structures are much easier to maintain long term. And obviously we know the more simple something is with ADHD, even better. And when it comes to achieving anything with ADHD, we know that removing as much friction as is physically possible to take action on something is much more important for consistency than making it super optimal. And this is where actually utilizing more processed, more convenience foods come in. Now again, to reiterate, I am not anti-food quality. What you eat does matter, and I have actually done a whole video on some of the best foods that you can include for an ADHD brain, which you can go and check out. But what is more important than being super optimal is being consistent, is being able to eat in a way that ensures you can get enough protein, enough fiber, enough fruit and veg, eat to your body's needs, and then of course, if your goal is weight loss, be able to actually freaking stick to a calorie deficit. And what can work for neurodivergent brains so much better are things that require less prep, things that require less planning, things that aren't so complicated with all these crazy rules of you can have this many grams of this and not too much of that and track this and track that, fewer decisions, fewer things to consider. So sometimes that means slightly more processed convenience foods rather than everything from the ground, plants and this and that and the other. Sometimes that means that it looks a little bit more picky bits put together rather than a perfectly balanced meal. Sometimes that means eating the same kind of things day by day by day by day rather than changing up to have all these different varieties going in. And you know what? That is okay. It sometimes means having something with a few more ingredients in. That is okay. Because if this means that you can get enough protein, enough fiber, enough nutrients in a way that you can be consistent with, that's going to lead to the long-term results, whether that is weight loss or just being healthier. Because the thing is, processed doesn't mean harmful, right? These diets have created this fear-mongering, right? Remember that ADHD brains are much more likely to take things to extremes, right? So if we see something that's like an extreme claim, we're much more likely to believe it because we almost get a bit of a dopamine high from that. So if we see something's bad for us, we're more likely to go all in and believe it and do that 100%. But it's the damages in the dose, right? A little bit of processed food is not going to kill you. It's not going to stop you losing fat. It's eating it in large quantities consistently that does. And the same that if you can include a bit more processed food, which allows you to eat in a deficit, eat enough protein consistently, that is going to support your progress. Now, when I say processed foods, I don't mean a diet full of biscuits, a diet full of crisps, a diet full of McDonald's. What I do mean is processed alternatives to maybe the more whole food versions. So for example, pre-made mashed potato or root veg mash rather than preparing it yourself, microwave rices, breads for your carbohydrate sources. Now created a full guide with your proteins, fats and carbs, different examples for each that you can make easy, that require minimal prep, minimal planning, and some meal suggestions if you go to the link in the description. And again, I'm not saying that nutrition isn't important, and especially with ADHD, there are things that we want to consider if you do want to support your brain. And like I said earlier, there is a video you can go check out on that. So just remember, guys, the magic is in being consistent, not being perfect. And despite what these diets say that you should do, this is what's going to get you long-term results. And just remember as well that the reason these programs and diets do so well is because they are bold. They do say something different. Like if I tried to sell what I've told you today as a diet, I would make 0 sales because it doesn't sound sexy. They like the fact it sounds different and exciting and novel, and just be critical on that as well. When people make these big bold claims that it's this or it's that or it's black and it's white, it's usually because that's easier to get buy-in with and it just sounds sexier. So always keep your cynical head on. But over and out today, guys, remember, go check out the caption for that food list, and I will see you on another video.